Well, hey, all my friends, welcome once again to the Everyday Missionary Pod. It's not a podcast anymore, it's a pod, right? And I still think this is just funny, right? So, like, years ago, Apple is like moving and shaking. They're coming out with all these cool devices, and they're like, hey, it's not just music, it's also a way to listen to long format conversation and all of this stuff. So they dropped the idea of the podcast because of the Apple iPod. And ever since then, we still just call them podcasts. Like, it was brilliant. It was such a great marketing idea that nowadays people do podcasts that have no relationship to an Apple iPod at all, and yet it's still a podcast. Hence, we should now start calling them pod. I just think it's brilliant. It's like Band-Aids. All adhesive strips, we just call them Band-Aids. It doesn't matter the brand. Even though Band-Aid is a brand, it's such a brilliant name. All adhesive strips, we just call a Band-Aid. It's super interesting that way. I don't know. My brain is weird. Anyway, so welcome to the Everyday Missionary Pod. And we are in 2026. I have done 2 podcasts in the last 6 months. I'm really hoping that this is going to be a year where I can string together more than like 2 or 3. Like right here in my little notepad over here, I've already got a handful of topics I'm hoping to deal with over the next couple of weeks and everything else. And so I'm hoping I can string together some kind of drive here. I don't know. We're going to see. But this is the first one for 2026, and I've been kind of kicking around this one a little bit. In fact, it's been rolling around actually for over a year, and I've just let it kind of incubate back there, kind of deciding how I want to approach it or whatever else. And with some recent things, all the more I'm like, man, I'm just going to go ahead and try to outline this, and I think I'm going to do it in a way that's imperfect, but hopefully you get a sense of what kind of is the driver, I think, even of this podcast. Now, if I go back to the birth of the podcast, now a pod, but the birth of the podcast was back in 2017, I think it is. So this has been a long haul, man. We've been doing this for a while. And for the first couple of years, it was really what I would call kind of, here's how to be a Christian in the Christian space. So it was all about kind of what we would call in the churchy world, discipleship, right? This is how you have these Christian disciplines. This is how you grow in your faith. This is how you figure out how to study the Bible and implement those things. That was kind of the focus of it. And then in 2020, I think the tone kind of shifted, and there was a lot more talking about current events and then trying to speak about how Christianity should play in the current sphere of things. And I think ever since then, there's been kind of that drive, right? And with that, then, I think there is a reality about the pod that was more encouraging for some and agitating for others. And then from that, as time goes on, I think something that has happened, and I get this totally because I do the same thing. Let's just be honest. When people are calling out other sides, every side is hypocritical. Every side is inconsistent. Every side is, idolizing their group and demonizing another group. And, they're ascribing motives to this group that they don't ascribe to that group. It's all really true. And so even in light of that, throughout the history of the podcast for like the last 5 years, there's been, I think at times like, we know Matt's real motivations. Like he's saying this stuff, but we know what's really going on inside of him. And so I would have these different motivations described to me, and I totally get it because I do the same thing to other people. I'm not really faulting anybody for that. I'm saying I get it. And so all the more I thought, man, I should really do a podcast that clarifies not so much, quote, my motivations, but really what my priorities are in light of my motivations, and to help better educate what I think is a better, more Jesus-like way, which is actually the entire heart of the podcast. My whole agenda every time is what is the most Jesus-like way, not as what's the most religious way, or what is the most conservative way, or what is the most progressive way, or what is the most Republican way or Democrat. Those things don't interest me. I'm trying to figure out how can we think and feel and act like Jesus, and doing that, realizing that the way of Jesus is incredibly not only uncomfortable, it's impractical in the real world. Like, honestly, I think at times people have Jesus as a poster child, but they don't actually want to do what he says in the real world because they go, that doesn't really work in the real world. And so it's like, Jesus saves me from my sins to send me to heaven and not go to hell. But other than that, you can't really live Jesus's lifestyle in this world because you're going to get walked over. It's too weak. It's naive. It's silly. You get punked. So it's almost like, let's all wink and nod. Jesus didn't really expect us to do the Sermon on the Mount. That's nuts. He just died to send us to heaven. And then we kind of do whatever we want to do here as long as it's moral. and we're not, quote, immoral, and even that's a little suspect, right? But we're really not going to take the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, and the fruit of the Spirit, and the definition of love, all of that seriously. We'll study it in our Bible studies. We'll memorize those things. We'll give kind of platitude to it, but we don't really plan to do it, and not in any dramatic way. So you can tell I'm already on a soapbox. And so from that, I've really approached the podcast from the perspective of what is my tribe, and where is my tribe who claims Jesus not always choosing to embrace the way of Jesus in the real world? And that's the heart of the podcast. If this was a pundit podcast and I just wanted to highlight how the other side is so bad and evil and wrong, right? So let's say this was a Democrat podcast and I just wanted to point out all of the failures of the Republicans, super easy. If this was a Republican podcast and I just wanted to highlight all of the failures of the Democrats, super easy. What's really hard is when you're trying to do something like this, where I don't care about talking about people outside of my tribe. I care about talking about the people inside my tribe. And more than that, I'm less about trying to come like as a kind of a Joel Osteen, encourage my tribe, and more to encourage my tribe in the way of being like Jesus, which may sometimes not feel so great. And that's kind of the motivation here, right? So I'm not interested in rah-rahing my tribe, though there's going to be times for that. If anything, I'm trying to get our tribe to be like Jesus, and so in that sense, I'm rah-rah. But what I don't want to do is just point out how we got it all figured out and everybody else doesn't, but rather I want to focus on the things that we need to figure out so we can better reach those people, and that being much of the heart. That I'm not here to spin up against our religious, social, or political others. I'm trying to figure out how we can become better Jesus-like to reach other people and see them not as enemies and targets, but as neighbors and potential kind of brothers and sisters in the way of Jesus. Like, that's kind of the essence behind this whole thing. So I just want to be clear about that, because I know how easy it is, and I get it. I mean, I'm not naive to it, that there's this, Matt, you're saying you're this, but you're really that, and this is really your motivation, is just to kind of attack things because this is more your political interest and that's not your political interest. And that's honestly not my motivation. I'm just telling you flat out, that's not my motivation. But inside of that, I think there is some complexities, so that I just wanted to kind of peel back the onion, right? Because even this week I posted something on social media about the invasion of Venezuela. And I'm like, and honestly, like, my thing was just, don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining, right? Like, don't tell me it's for this and this when it's really for that and that. And I felt the same way about the Iraq war. Don't tell me it's for this when it's really for that. And in this case in particular, I think because there is so much Christian reputation attached to the current administration, I think all the more than as a follower of Jesus, I'm like, followers of Jesus should have more integrity in the spaces of government, not less. And so you should just be honest. It is regime change. I know we ran on not doing regime change. I know our intelligence director is very anti-regime change, but this was just an occasion, a situation, and an opportunity where we are going against our own agenda, but for this reason. Honestly, then I'm not making a post, right? I'm not saying a thing because you were just outright honest about it. You're like, that's what it is. But when it's like this really obvious pretense that everybody knows isn't true, and so everybody's like, well, Matt, everybody knows the real reason was this. I'm like, right, everybody knows the real reason. Then why bother giving a lame reason or a very low-level reason when everybody knows the real reason, and you should just be honest about the real reason? And in being honest about the real reason, even if people disagree, at least you were honest about the real reason. And see, I'm saying that as a leader of an organization, right? And I'm saying that in the church space. Let me just be clear with you. There are many leaders in churches that frankly pee on their church's legs and tell them it's raining. In other words, they do things behind the scenes. They fire people for certain reasons, whatever it is. And then they give a completely different public story. And that has never been the way I've operated. I have been a pastor for 30 years. I have never operated that way. I've had to come forward and say, here's a really bad circumstance. Here's where we really stepped in it. Here's where we're having to make a hard decision, and here's why. But it was always honest and thoughtful, and whether we were going to take our licks or not, this is the way you do it. So in some ways I go, yes, I have an expectation around executive leadership in particular, in all leadership, where you should tell the story, whether it's going to be well received or not, but just tell the story as it is, and don't make up a story because, again, you're trying to pull some strings or whatever else. And so that's kind of my thing about, don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining. Just tell me, hey, this is the reality of things, right? And so that's kind of the essence of that. And so with all of that, and kind of saying what I said, I think at times it's like, oh, you just have political motivations. And so here's what I'm going to be clear. And this is kind of the essence of the podcast today. That was a long preamble into the podcast. I believe followers of Jesus should in fact be political. I absolutely believe we should be engaged in policy things. I believe we should be engaged in political things, but, big, hard, huge, stopping you in your tracks. But I really struggle and don't believe that Christians should be partisan. Followers of Jesus should be political, should care about policy. I'm going to talk about that first. And then at the same time, I think we should be very cautiously partisan. And in our partisanship, which is, again, a little bit of the tone of the podcast, in our partisanship, we need to be consistent. In other words, we would call out in our own group the same things we'd call out in another group. That we are wise as serpents and gentle as doves, and we're more kingdom-minded than empire-minded or Babylon-minded. If I use the book of Revelation, all the nations of the earth are Babylons. And we need to be kingdom-wise in Babylonian context. That's Daniel, to a large extent. I think that's Joseph in Egypt, same kind of concept there. And I think the example of Jesus is in that space too. And so, again, I want to reinforce, I believe pastors and followers of Jesus and those of the faith should absolutely be political. They should care about policy. They should loosely, lightly, with, I would say, no loyalties, be partisan. Pick a party, great. But you're still trying to figure out how to be like Jesus in that space because you're a missionary to that group. You're a missionary to that partisan group. And that means you need to be kingdom objective, and you don't want to go like, oh, I'm going to idolize them and I'm going to demonize them. And when they do a bad thing, I'm not going to mention it, but when they do a bad thing, I'm going to flip out about it. That means we're not being kingdom driven. We're being partisan driven. So let me get into the politics and policy stuff first. Right now I'm in the preparations of a series in the Book of the 12. Maybe you're not familiar with the idea of the Book of the 12, but it's the minor prophets is what we call it. But I like the Book of the 12 more because it's 12 voices. The Hebrew tradition considered that to be one work. And those 12 voices are calling out to a lot of different problems. Jonah is interesting because the prophet Jonah, the story of Jonah is he's the one that's wrong in the story. In other words, the nations are, Jonah's a bit of Israel. And in that sense, it's kind of like a reflection of the problems of Israel. But he's not calling out Israel like other prophets. He's calling out Nineveh. But God's reaching Nineveh, and Jonah hates Nineveh, and Jonah's bitter that God loves the other side. He's bitter that God's going to show mercy to Israel's enemies, and so the prophet Jonah is an illustration of the kind of prophet not to be. Don't hate the other side. Don't want mercy for you and judgment for them, right? So it's a really interesting thing. All the way do you get to like Malachi, where there's injustice toward women who are getting divorced and have nothing, and there's injustice against the poor. Amos is a lot of that same thing where there's power that's in control and power is corrupted and it kind of squashes the little guy. Isaiah is about, hey man, you do all your religious stuff, but you forget the widow, the orphan, and the poor. And so God's like, you make me sick. I want to spit you out. I'm not going to bless you in any way. Like, that's the prophets, right? And so the prophets, what they spoke into had incredible political ramification and spoke directly into what we would call policy towards certain groups. Then you get to Jesus. Was Jesus political? Yes, because a lot of what he said had implications for policy and government and leadership, but he wasn't partisan. More than that, where Jesus got in trouble a lot with Israel and the nation and the leadership in Israel is because he wasn't bad-mouthing Rome. He wasn't talking about how pagan and evil and perverse and greedy they are, because he's like, I'm not concerned about those who don't claim the name of Yahweh. I'm concerned about those who do. That was true to the prophets. Very rarely, like Nahum would be a good example of one of the minor prophets who's speaking to kind of truly like another nation. But even there, it is a nation very adjacent to Yahweh at that point, because that it was actually Nineveh 100 years before, right? So, like Nineveh repents, and 100 years later, now Nahum's stepping in. It's a sequel, and he's speaking to the problems that they had forgotten Yahweh as they had embraced him back when Jonah was mad that they embraced him. Once again, it goes back to those who are of the community of faith. The prophets and Jesus spoke wisdom toward, spoke conviction toward, called out sin in, and yet all of that had political and policy implications. So, for example, remember when the leadership comes to Jesus and they're like, hey, bro, here's a coin, man. And what should we do? Should we pay taxes to Caesar, or do we do stuff for other reasons? Is it God or this evil pagan empire? And they're trying to trap him, because if Jesus backs the Romans, that's a political sour move, right? That's going to be, from the perspective of their world, he's siding in a partisan way with the opposition. So they think they got him. And then he has this really cool, like, hey, man, whose picture's on it? Well, give that dude his stuff. You know what I mean? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. In a weird sort of way, that is a political statement. That does kind of bring up a certain kind of policy implication, pay your taxes, but it also is not going to sit well from a partisan perspective. So political, yes. Policy, even, yes. It's ultimately a moral issue on how you're realizing the kingdoms of this world are different than the kingdom of God, and you need to live kingdom of God, even if it costs you when it comes to the kingdoms of this world or the comforts of this world or empire or whatever. But he is saying something that would have sat uncomfortably with his own group, because his own group was being wrong there, right? It's the same thing when Jesus gets into how to handle the poor. Like, repeatedly, he is calling out the nation for handling the poor. In fact, here's an interesting one that it's so interesting how you can read the Bible for years and you're going to come across a famous story and you're going to apply it a certain way, and you're missing the application completely because you didn't read just before it what was going on to read what's coming after it. So here's an example. You remember the story of the widow and her 2 mites, right? And we hear that story and go, see how much she was trusting God. See how faithful she was. She was destitute, and she threw her last 2 little copper coins in there because she was trusting God to take care of her in every way. And she was so faith-filled. She got rid of every single cent she had to prove she loves God. And so, man, we should have widows everywhere emptying their bank accounts to give to religious institutions, right? No! But weirdly enough, we actually use that story a little bit of like, see, this is how we need to trust God, by giving to institutions or giving to the church or giving to kingdom purposes or whatever else. And she's the example of that. And I'm like, no, that is not what is being taught there. Here's what I mean. Go back and read the story for yourself. Immediately before it, Jesus lays into religion, and he says to religion, you all go into widows' houses and you just throttle them. You take them for every penny. You rip them off. How dare you, is what he's saying is, how dare you? You're supposed to care for the widow and the orphan. Isaiah told you that. Amos told you that. Malachi told you that. Everybody told you that. And you continue to take advantage of the lowly and the poor. You continue to enrich yourself knowing there's the poor down the street. You keep enriching yourself in the name of God or in the name of religion or whatever it is. And he's like, shame on you. And then immediately he goes into the story of that widow and her 2 mites there at the temple. And he's not using her as an example of like, yeah, they are terrible, but look how awesome she is. He's saying they're terrible, and look how she's giving the last of her money away. And instead of them using the coffers of the church to care for a widow, they're willing to take her money still. He says, look at this poor widow. He says, poor widow, right? He doesn't say, look at this awesome widow. He says, look at this poor widow, right? They're literally robbing widows, taking their homes from them. And when they come to the very temple where they could get aid, instead they're still taking from her. That is weirdly enough, because it's the poor and it's about policy and taking care of the needs of people. And I know you'll go, well, the church should take care of people. Well, guess what? That was also the social institutional government in the area. Like, Rome was not really the institutional government of the society and of the people. The religious institution and the kind of the social governance institution were wed together. And so from that, Jesus is making a policy statement, and he's making a political statement that has real implications, and he's calling them out for their lack of faithfulness to that, right? And that's kind of true across the boards. Like, Jesus isn't afraid to say things toward his own group, that are inconsistent with God's priorities, right? That's the essence of that. And so in the same way, when he then rolls in with the Sermon on the Mount, there's all sorts of things he's saying there that you could say certainly has policy implication. He is telling us to live in uncomfortable, upside down, uncommon ways that are incredibly inconvenient to the way the world works. And if we're going to truly be like Jesus, and we're going to think like Jesus, and we're going to do life like Jesus, then we should be using the equity we have in life, whether that be our money or our vote or whatever, to get behind the things that Jesus most highly valued. And while those are not going to fit into an easy partisan bag always, they do have policy and political implication. So when you read through the Sermon on the Mount, loving your enemies has a policy implication. It has a political implication. Caring for the outcast, the poor, the needy, the foreigner, and the stranger has policy and political implication. You know, I've talked about kind of the whole thing about immigration. And I get a lot of pushback where it's like, but they're here illegally. And I'm not arguing that they're here illegally. I'm just asking the question of, is that the best legal thing? Could we change the legal apparatus to be more humanitarian? Matter of fact, here's something that I think some people would be like, really? Back in 2015, Rubio was my guy, man. Rubio was my guy. And what I liked about Marco Rubio at the time is he had this really awesome border policy that was way more humane. It was actually grounded in reality. It gave dignity to people, but it still was going to create a really solid border policy. And it was all about changing the laws so that it would be much more flourishing oriented for all parties. It was really a good idea. And so when I bring up like, hey man, what about the stranger and the foreigner? Because that is not like, well, it comes up once, you know, in the scriptures. It is a major, massive theme. It is a part of loving your neighbor. Like when the Levitical law comes down, it's very clear. You love your Israelite neighbor and you love your foreigner. You treat them just like a fellow citizen, it says. So when I'm bringing this up, I'm not bringing it up because it's some kind of partisan position for me. I go, it's a scriptural issue which has political implications. I'm asking for a policy change. I believe all followers of Jesus would want to see policy changes that are in alignment with the scriptures, especially when the scriptures are super obvious on a thing. And so from that, I go, yeah, maybe that's not going to be popular with this partisan group, and it's going to be more popular with another partisan group. But don't worry, there's going to be another topic where then it's flipped, and the partisan group that hated the one loves the next one. And this is why we as followers of Jesus, we need to be very loosely partisan, but very thoughtful when it comes to policy and politics. Because policy and politics are really just about how you organize a culture, right? That's all it comes down to. And Jesus was speaking heavily about how you organize a culture because his whole kingdom mindset is being a culture that brings flourishing and blessing to the rest of culture. If you look at the architecture of the way it works, is that God rose up Israel to be a light to the Gentile nations because he promised Abraham he was going to bless all the nations through him. And then when you get to Galatians, you see that the gospel was talked about to Abraham, which is to bless all the nations. And so the core of the gospel, what you really understand, and we just kind of reduce it down to me getting saved and going to heaven. It's such a minor part of what the whole gospel is. The essence of the gospel is about God bringing flourishing and blessing to the nations as promised to Abraham. He's reclaiming what was lost in Genesis 3. And when Jesus starts his community of faith and gives them kingdom-minded values, gives them the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, he's like, this is how we turn it around. We don't turn it around by cherry-picking these ethics and ditching those ethics and becoming partisan and choosing this Babylon versus that Babylon. He's like, no, you bring my ideas to bear on the culture that you're in. You bring welfare to where you live, blessing to your community. That's Jeremiah 29. And you bring transformation that way, right? So the Sermon on the Mount, while it's very impractical, is calling us to do radical things like not go around and have a bunch of litigation and sue one another, not going around and making overt demands just because I've been wrong so I can wrong the other in return. Asks us to take our fidelity seriously and our commitment seriously. When there's broken relationship, that we go out of our way to try to fix it as much as is possible, that we are not judgy toward others, but rather we deal with our own judgment in us so we can be helpful toward others instead of hypercritical toward others. But part of that sometimes means you have to speak into the reality of things. And Jesus did that too. He spoke into the reality of things. He said things that weren't comfortable. He said things that might have come a little awkwardly, but he was saying it primarily to those who say, we're believers, we're of God's people, we're his community, and he was just calling that stuff out. If we're going to truly change the world, we have to be more like the kingdom. And if we don't want to really change the world with kingdom apparatuses, go be partisan, go do whatever, use whatever tools you want. Just don't pull Jesus into that equation because he doesn't fit that mold. Like Jesus, if he were here today, any group in the world could not claim him. He would not vote Republican and he wouldn't vote Democrat. And I don't know if he'd be a socialist or a capitalist or a communist. I really don't know. Like, I know we all go, no, he wouldn't be this or he wouldn't be that. I'm like, he wouldn't be any of it. He just wouldn't be any of it. And he wouldn't even care about any of that, but he would care about human flourishing. He would care about how you present the kingdom in the world. And he would do and say things that would disrupt every side's ultimate like partisanship, right? And that's the thing I'm certain of, that Jesus tends to tick off anybody with a blindsided agenda, and I think that's the essence of it. And so for me, when I look at this, I go, yeah, we as followers of Jesus should care about policy. We should care about, in that sense, politics. We should care about how our society functions. And for me personally, I think the scriptures scream care of your neighbor, love of your enemy, care for the poor and the needy. So when we look and go, they're just lazy and they don't work and these homeless people are terrible and everything else, like literally Jesus has in Matthew 25, that kind of talk sends you straight to hell. Like, I'm not saying that, that's what he says. That's hell unleashed in the world. That is like when you can't take in the stranger or help the poor or the naked. He's like, you're doing that against me. You can sit there and say, I'm sick of them messing up our cities or whatever else. And he's like, you're saying it to me? You're saying it right to my face. Every time you're saying it right to my face. He makes it so clear. It's so wild. Like when we stand before Jesus, like the things he's not going to care about, or a lot of the things we get fired up about, and then the stuff that he's really going to care about. Like I've said this before, if you go to Matthew 25 and you look at the criteria that he says separates the sheep and the goats, honestly ask yourself, of the criteria he gives, how many times have you done those things in your entire life, right? How many times have you gone to prison to see those who were incarcerated? Because it's on the list. How many times have you taken a stranger into your home and cared for them? Because it's on the list. How many times have you clothed personally the naked? How many times have you done that? I'm saying that to me too, right? So I just want to be clear. I think we take a lot of comfort in, as long as I have the right doctrines, I'm good. And it's funny how Jesus really never said doctrines were the thing to get you in. He said faith in him, and then living as he lived is the priority of what he's doing, right? And right now you're going to be like, that's work salvation. I'm like, no, it's not. It's Jesus. Faith is allegiance. Faith is allegiance. And that's what he's looking for. And allegiance to what he says. And this is always going to be my concern. You can tell I'm a little passionate about this. And forgive me if I sound a little barbed. I don't mean that. I'm just really enthusiastic. And I'm preaching to myself, man. Like, I'm trying to master this more because I've said this before on the podcast. It's like, I think there's people who go like, you can't stand this side and you're secretly loyal to that side. And I would say, no, I think when people are claiming Jesus a lot, but I don't see Jesus a lot in what's being claimed, I get more passionate about that than those who I kind of go, they're maybe not even believers, or they don't really care about belief, or they don't really care about faith. Like I don't hold them to the same standard at all. And that's what's so strange to me sometimes. I hear Christians holding disbelievers to standards when we're simply called to love and reach them. And yet of ourselves, judgment begins in the house of God, Peter says. We should be holding ourselves much more accountable. But I almost see like we think we're meant to be culture warriors more than like emissaries for Jesus. Like, we're supposed to fight the whatever as opposed to reach the whatever. And so all the more, I just want to bring everything we do in this pod back to, hey, how are we going to be like Jesus? How are we going to think like him, feel like him, react like him, talk like him, see the world like him? Like he looked at the world and said, Father, forgive them. They don't realize what they're doing. He looked at the masses with compassion because they were sheep without a shepherd. Like that was the way he looked. But he also looked at religion. He also looked at kind of the partisanship of his day and knew that there is always going to be a toxicity in there because it will, again, be blind to one thing and then really eagle-eye critical of the other thing. And it's going to sound that way. Like it's going to be no question about it, right? And so for me, that's the real passion here. So again, should Christians be political and policy caring? Yes. Should they be partisan? For me, I'm not going to tell you it's a sin. I'm just going to tell you it's very easy to lose sight of importance because we're all really good at being tribal. We have been for a long time. Human beings are just good at being tribal. And in our tribalism, we can get really intuitively passionate, right? Either to the left or to the right. And so much so that we lose objectivity at times. And we start to then hate the other side or be disgusted by the other side or resent the other side or see the other side as a thing to be fought as opposed to a thing to be loved and to be reached and to be invested into and to be served, right? And I'm sure for some of you, you're going to listen to this and go, Matt, just whatever, go pound sand. I'm fine with that. If there's anything I embraced back in 2020, I embraced the reality, not that I'm like a supernatural prophet, but I embraced the reality that the prophets were all geared, and Jesus was geared into speaking into his own tribe, their own tribe, to highlight their problems, and they always got their butt kicked. I understand that. At the same time, God keeps sending the spokespeople, still trying to break it loose because it does break it loose for some. It does break it loose for some. Others, it's just not going to break it loose. And I get that, and I get how fiery we all get. I get how loyal or how feisty we get depending on the thing. And yet I think my heart comes back to, as best as we can, to try to be as objective as we can. When our tribe blows it, we shouldn't excuse it. When our tribe does something that we all know, like, it's not right, we should say that. We should say, that's not the right thing. Like, this is still my tribe, but that's not the right thing. And when the other tribe does it, we shouldn't gloat or be gleeful, like, ha, ha, you got your own, you stupid morons, or whatever else. Because it's just not how Jesus rolled. And that's the only thing I care about. I just care about being like Jesus. But honestly, at the core, that's what it matters to me, or that's why it matters to me. And I think probably in that, maybe one last clarifier outside of that, but just kind of an addendum. I think in recent years, people have kind of looked and said, Matt, you've become, quote, more political. And I would say, right, but I think what they mean by that is they think it's partisan. And I go, it's not really partisan. It may be political and maybe policy. I think it's also consistency, right? And here's what I mean by that. So for, I've shared this before. I'm a registered Republican, right? And for the longest time in that tribe, it was always about character matters, character counts. If you don't have internal, deep, consistent, sacrificial character, you're not going to be well equipped to lead at a major level. That would be true for ministry. That would be true for corporations. That would be true for governments. I remember going through the Clinton era and how many people in my tribe thought he was the worst of the worst of the worst because he proved he didn't have real character, because you can't lead from that place. When the primaries had come up, it was always a discussion of character first, character counts, character matters. That was just the drum. And in 2015, it was a lot about character matters. And when you looked at that primary run, again, I really dug Rubio. He was my dude. When I looked at that run, early on, a lot of Republican pundits and a lot of pastors all said the same thing about Donald Trump. He does not have the moral integrity or character to lead. They're all like, that guy is all these things, right? And then it was shown all the things that he is. And what I watched is my tribe in the end say, you know what, though? We're not really hiring a pastor. We're not really, it's not about, yeah, he's done those things. That's locker room talk. Yeah, he's no saint. Yeah, it's not. And like, if you go, your integrity is that thing you don't give up, no matter how impractical it is. I kind of watched that group, that partisan group, divorce themselves from their deepest integrity, this thing of consistency for expediency and success, and divorce themselves from their deepest convictions. This isn't just my opinion. There's plenty of others that I go, they are on the right and saw that the same way, right? And so for me then, what's most deeply important about that is we kept banging the drum, oftentimes against a disbelieving world, that character counts, character counts, character counts, character counts. And part of that was, and your people don't have character, but now we have our person, And even though they don't have character, we now have effectiveness, and we lost our moral authority. And I don't know if that's the right phrasing. We lost our moral credibility as soon as we gave that up. And now the very people we're trying to reach go, you guys are not consistent with your stance on morality and character. You're not. Now, I'm sure there's going to be some that disagree with me and go, no, man, President Trump has all the moral character and authority in the world. Agree to disagree. Now, I'm not against, it's like I don't get angry at the dude. It's not like that. I'm just saying, like, from a track record of just integrity, right? Just a track record of integrity, a track record of did they tell the truth? Did they treat people with dignity and respect? Did they try to bring people together as opposed to divide people openly and hostilely and everything else? I'm like, you shouldn't run a church that way. You shouldn't run a company that way. You shouldn't run a country that way. You shouldn't run a partisan policy group that way. You just shouldn't run it that way. And so really for me, I'm like, I just watched my tribe give up its values for effectiveness. And I don't think we get that back. Like, I think it continues to be that way, where I see excuse making for what I'm not talking about policies now. I'm talking about excuse making for poor tone and behaviors, even if some of those policies would be policies I can embrace. Like, I go, because maybe I just got duped by the notion that character counts in leadership, and maybe it doesn't. Maybe that's the lesson now. The lesson is, as long as they're effective, who cares whether they have integrity or character? But for me, that was the thing. And so, where people kind of think this is a very partisan, agenda-driven thing, for me, really wasn't. Like, if you go back and you were to listen to all the podcasts for the last 7-8 years or whatever else, really very little of it had a lot of that kind of stuff into it, until I found, like, hey man, Christians lost a great deal of credibility for the sake of partisanship. And some of those policy issues, I think, were probably scriptural issues. Some of those things are what I would call preferential issues, but it was at the cost of the reputation, in particular, of evangelicalism. And so now evangelicalism is so seen as a partisan thing, it's not really seen as a Jesus thing. And that's the most tragic thing, because we should be mostly seen as a Jesus thing, so much so that we'll call our own out when it's applicable. And then for those who are not our kind, we're going to love them regardless of where they're driving, right? So that's kind of the thing. And I know that was in a lot of space and going to a lot of places and everything else. I also know that not everybody's going to agree with that take, or they're going to say, yeah, but you still do this and this and this. And you know what? I'm going to admit, incredibly inconsistent, trying to get better at that all the time. I will not shy away from the fact that I can be very inconsistent, but I also wanted to be clear where I think we are, to the space we're to be in. I think when we're not in political and policy space, that's unfortunate, because we should be trying to figure out how we bring the blessing of Jesus's realm to bear on the world that we live in. We should all want to do that. I think that's different than just pure ethics. I think the ethics of the kingdom can be different than the ethics of, let's say, the Hebrew scriptures even. I think we're talking about Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, Jesus-centered ethics for societies. And I think that's dramatically different at times than what I see, in particular, even in my own camp, what they advocate for. I just see a lot of advocating for things that are not what the scriptures advocate for. In particular, they're not the things that the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, just the Gospels would advocate for. And I think we miss the mark. And I think we hold disbelieving people to biblical things, and then we don't hold believing people to biblical things, because, again, we get too pulled in. We get too fired up about the stuff. In fact, it's probably true that most of us listen to partisan preachers more than we listen to Jesus-centered preachers. And so all the more we get informed by that, and all the more that's where we're having to uncouple ourselves from that. So I'm just hoping I'm giving you food for thought. I'm just hoping to make you think a little bit. I continue to think, but I just wanted to come through on that yes, we should be in the political space. Yes, we should care about policy making. That should be driven through Jesus and his message to the world. What we shouldn't do is be all that fiery about partisanship, right? We just shouldn't. Again, like I said, I'm a registered Republican, but I felt like I stayed put and it moved. It just kind of moved. And And that was kind of a Russell Moore thing. Like, I didn't change. It all moved out of practicality and out of positioning and out of feeling threatened by the left or whatever else. And so in some ways, maybe since then, I would say I wouldn't even probably, at some point I probably should just change my affiliation. Because again, I'm not passionate about partisanship either way. I am passionate about what Jesus cares about. What did he care about? He cared about justice. He cared about the poor. He cared about the widow. He cared about the outsider. He cared about making enemies friends. He cared about, making sure that, the people that were truly marginalized were not marginalized. He tended to say the people in power, the people in control will utilize power to keep their power and suppress others. He called that stuff out. He reminded us, man, if you're fighting over taxes, you're fighting over the wrong thing. If you care about that stuff, man, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, render unto God's what is God. Like, that's just the thing. Seek the kingdom first. Don't worry about budgets. Don't worry about finances. Don't worry about money. That's Matthew chapter 6 going into Matthew chapter 7 a little bit. He's like, don't worry about that. Worry about the kingdom, because that's what matters most, right? Be like me. That's what matters most. And I think the more we do that and the more we don't get caught up in all this stuff, you ready? The more we're going to be effective everyday missionaries.